On the evening of April 3, 2003, inside the Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAlester, Scott Allen Hayne lay strapped to a gurney. At exactly 6:07 p.m., the state of Oklahoma carried out his execution by lethal injection. He was the last person in the United States ever executed for a crime committed as a juvenile. Hayne had been only 17 when he and an accomplice abducted Michael Halton and Laura Sanders during a carjacking that turned into a nightmare. The young couple were locked in the trunk of their own car, driven to a remote area, and burned alive after the vehicle was set on fire. It was a crime that shocked Oklahoma, not only for its cruelty, but for the age of one of its perpetrators. For nearly 16 years, Hayne's case moved through courts and appeals that questioned whether someone so young should face the death penalty. Supporters argued his youth made him less culpable, that society should show mercy to offenders who were still legally children at the time of their crimes. Others insisted the brutality of the murders outweighed any consideration of age. As the chemicals coursed through his veins, Hayne offered no lengthy speech. Witnesses reported he accepted his fate quietly, his final moments marked by silence rather than protest. Within minutes his ended, but his name remained tied to a larger legal debate that would soon change the nation. Because 2 years later, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that executing juvenile offenders violated the Constitution's ban on cruel and unusual punishment. That decision spared every other juvenile offender on death row, but it came too late for Scott Hayne. But to understand how a teenager from Tulsa became the final juvenile executed in America, how one night of violence destroyed 2 innocent lives and set another on the path to death row, and why his case still echoes in debates about crime, punishment, and the meaning of justice, we have to go back. Back to the night of October 6, 1987. Back to the streets of Tulsa, where 2 young friends went looking for trouble. Back to the moment when Scott Hayne crossed a line that could never be undone. If you're drawn to stories of justice, betrayal, and the people who reach a point of no return, make sure to subscribe to No Way Out. This is where true crime meets truth. Real cases, real consequences. The darkest corners of human decision broken down into tiny pieces so you can see every detail and make your own conclusions better. Scott Allen Hayne was born on June 2, 1970, in Tulsa, Oklahoma, into a world that would shape him in ways no one could predict. His entry into life coincided with a period of social upheaval in America, but for the Hayne family, the challenges were more immediate and personal. His mother struggled with alcoholism. The family dynamics were troubled from the start, creating an environment where stability was absent and supervision was inconsistent. The Tulsa of Scott's childhood was a city dealing with economic uncertainty as the oil industry that had built the region faced volatility. Working-class families like the Haynes often found themselves struggling to maintain stability in an environment where employment could disappear overnight and social services were limited. These economic pressures added stress to families already dealing with personal challenges like addiction and mental health issues. Scott's early childhood was marked by the absence of consistent parental guidance. His mother's alcoholism meant that her attention and care were unpredictable, varying with her sobriety and the progression of her addiction. During her drinking periods, Scott was often left to fend for himself or placed in the care of relatives who were already dealing with their own challenges. The impact of parental alcoholism on children was beginning to be understood in the 1970s and 1980s, but resources for intervention were limited. Children like Scott often developed coping mechanisms that included seeking attention through negative behavior, testing boundaries to see if anyone cared enough to enforce them, and learning to manipulate situations to meet their basic needs. As Scott entered his teenage years, his problems became visible to the authorities through his interactions with the juvenile justice system. He accumulated convictions for trespassing, theft, and unauthorized use of a motor vehicle. These weren't just pranks or typical teenage rebellion. They were escalating signs of someone who had little respect for other people's property or rights, and who had learned that rules could be broken without severe consequences. The trespassing charges revealed Scott's comfort with entering spaces where he didn't belong. These incidents often involved breaking into abandoned buildings, construction sites, or private property after hours. Each successful trespassing incident reinforced his belief that he could operate outside normal social boundaries without facing serious consequences. The theft charges showed a progression from taking small items to more valuable property. Scott learned that other people's belongings could become his simply by taking them. These crimes ranged from shoplifting in stores to stealing items from cars and homes. Each theft provided immediate gratification while teaching him that other people existed, primarily as sources of things he wanted. The unauthorized use of motor vehicles was particularly significant in Scott's criminal development. These incidents involved taking cars without permission, sometimes from acquaintances and sometimes from strangers. The mobility provided by stolen vehicles opened up new criminal opportunities and gave Scott a sense of power and freedom that his chaotic home life didn't provide. The juvenile justice system of the 1980s tried to intervene in Scott's escalating criminal behavior, but the programs available were limited in scope and effectiveness. Court-ordered counseling sessions were brief and infrequent. Probation supervision was minimal due to high caseloads and limited resources. The detention facilities were overcrowded and focused more on punishment than rehabilitation. Scott moved through this system without receiving the intensive treatment his family's situation and behavior patterns demanded. Each encounter with juvenile authorities followed a similar pattern: arrest, brief court appearance, minimal consequence, and release back to the same environment that had contributed to his criminal behavior. This cycle reinforced his belief that the legal system was ineffective and that he could continue his criminal activities without facing serious long-term consequences. His mother's alcoholism meant supervision at home was inconsistent at best. During her periods of sobriety, she might attempt to establish rules and boundaries, but these efforts were undermined by her relapses and the chaos they created. Scott learned to manipulate his mother's guilt about her drinking to avoid consequences for his behavior. What made Scott's situation more dangerous was his ability to find others who shared his disregard for law and social norms. In the summer of 1987, he began spending time with Robert Wayne Lambert, a young man 4 years older who would become his partner in increasingly serious crimes. The two found each other at a time when both were looking for excitement and easy money. Scott brought youthful recklessness to their partnership, while Lambert contributed a willingness to use violence that would escalate their criminal activities beyond simple theft. Their friendship developed around shared interests in drinking, petty crime, and the belief that they could take what they wanted from people they saw as easy targets. The partnership between Scott Hain and Robert Lambert was forming just as both young men were looking for ways to finance their lifestyle of drinking and petty crime. Robert Wayne Lambert appeared to be a typical 21-year-old when he met Scott Hain, but beneath the surface was a mind that functioned at the level of an 8-year-old child. Born with significant intellectual disabilities, Lambert had struggled with basic life skills from his earliest years. His IQ tested at 68, placing him in the category of mild mental retardation. Lambert's educational journey revealed the extent of his limitations. He barely managed to complete kindergarten, struggling with concepts that other children mastered easily. Special education classes provided some support, but Lambert found even these modified programs difficult to navigate. The academic demands, social interactions, and basic classroom routines were overwhelming for someone with his cognitive limitations. By 7th grade, the gap between Lambert and his peers had become insurmountable. He dropped out of school, unable to function successfully in even the most supportive educational environment. This decision ended his formal education, but didn't address the underlying issues that made daily life challenging for him. After leaving school, Lambert discovered that his intellectual disabilities severely limited his employment options. Jobs requiring basic math, reading comprehension, or complex instructions were beyond his capabilities. His thinking and reasoning abilities remained at the level of a second or third grade student, making it difficult for him to work or survive independently. Lambert's mental age of 8 years old affected every aspect of his decision-making. While his physical body had developed normally, his ability to understand consequences, control impulses, and make moral judgments remained frozen at a childhood level. This created a dangerous combination of adult physical capabilities with childlike reasoning and moral development. His intellectual disabilities made him particularly susceptible to influence from others. People with Lambert's condition often desperately want to fit in and be accepted, making them vulnerable to manipulation by those who recognize their limitations. They may agree to participate in activities they don't fully understand in order to maintain relationships and avoid rejection. Lambert's family had struggled to provide appropriate care and supervision for someone with his special needs. In the 1980s, community resources for adults with intellectual disabilities were limited, especially for those whose conditions hadn't been formally diagnosed or addressed during childhood. Many families found themselves without adequate support systems. The combination of Lambert's intellectual disabilities and lack of appropriate supervision created a situation where he was vulnerable to making poor decisions. His desperate desire for acceptance and friendship made him an easy target for someone like Scott Hain, who could manipulate Lambert's limitations for criminal purposes. When Lambert met Scott Hain in 1987, he found someone who seemed to accept him and include him in activities. For Lambert, this relationship provided the social connection he craved, but he lacked the cognitive ability to understand that Scott was leading him toward increasingly dangerous criminal behavior. The partnership between these two damaged young men was forming just as both were looking for ways to finance their lifestyle of drinking and petty crime. While Scott Hain and Robert Lambert were beginning their destructive partnership in the summer of 1987, two hardworking young people were building positive lives in the same city of Tulsa. Michael William Houghton, born on December 9, 1959, had grown into a 27-year-old man who valued family, work, and community connections. His working-class upbringing had instilled in him the belief that success came through dedication and treating others with respect. Michael's marriage to Tina represented hope and planning for the future. The couple was actively trying to have children and making plans that extended years into the future. They talked about expanding their family, buying a house, and building the kind of stable middle-class life that seemed achievable through hard work and dedication. Michael's parents, Ashley and Delma Houghton, watched their son's happiness with pride, seeing him as someone who brought energy and joy to family gatherings. Michael's work in the restaurant industry put him in regular contact with coworkers who became genuine friends. The service industry created bonds between people who shared the challenges of dealing with difficult customers, long hours, and the physical demands of restaurant work. Among these workplace friendships was his relationship with Laura Lee Sanders, a younger colleague who shared his work ethic and positive outlook. Laura Lee Sanders was born on January 8, 1965, to William Arthur Sanders and Carol Lee Stucker. At 22 years old, she was building her own independent life while maintaining strong connections to her family. Laura Lee was Carol's only daughter, making their relationship particularly close and important to both women. The Sanders family had experienced their share of challenges, but they remained committed to supporting each other through difficult times. Laura Lee's presence in the workplace brought lightness to difficult shifts. Her coworkers appreciated her willingness to help others and her ability to maintain a positive attitude even during the most stressful restaurant rushes. She approached her work with professionalism while building genuine friendships with people like Michael Houghton. Both Michael and Laura Lee came from families that had taught them to trust others and engage openly with their community. They had no experience with the kind of predatory behavior that was developing in the criminal partnership between Scott Hain and Robert Lambert. Their lives represented everything that Hain and Lambert were destroying through their escalating criminal activities. As October 1987 approached, these two worlds, the constructive lives of Michael and Laura Lee, and the destructive partnership of Hain and Lambert, were on a collision course that would forever change multiple families and ultimately influence American law. The collision between these two worlds had been building throughout the summer and fall of 1987, as Scott Hain and Robert Lambert embarked on a crime spree that would eventually lead them to Michael Houghton and Laura Lee Sanders. Their partnership had evolved from petty theft into a pattern of increasingly violent criminal behavior that stretched across Oklahoma and Kansas, leaving multiple victims traumatized and communities on edge. The first documented incident occurred on July 10, 1987, in Wichita, Kansas, where Hain and Lambert targeted a young woman who was going about her daily routine. They abducted her from a public area, using their combined physical presence and threats of violence to force her compliance. The assault that followed was methodical and cruel, showing that they had moved far beyond opportunistic crime into predatory behavior. The Wichita victim survived the attack but was left with physical and emotional trauma that would affect her for years. She provided police with descriptions of her attackers, but the details were limited due to the circumstances of the assault and the psychological impact of the violence. Hain and Lambert had been careful to choose a victim they believed would have difficulty identifying them later. Law enforcement in Kansas began investigating the assault as part of a pattern they were beginning to recognize. Detective work in the 1980s relied heavily on witness descriptions, physical evidence, and connecting crimes through similar methods of operation. Without DNA technology and modern forensic techniques, investigators had to build cases through careful accumulation of evidence and witness testimony. The Wichita Police Department circulated descriptions of the suspects to surrounding jurisdictions, but Hain and Lambert had already moved on to other activities. They were learning that by crossing state lines and varying their locations, they could avoid immediate capture while continuing their criminal activities. The success of their first major violent crime had a profound psychological effect on both perpetrators. They had discovered that they could commit serious felonies involving violence and sexual assault without immediate consequences. This realization removed psychological barriers that might have prevented further escalation and encouraged them to take greater risks with subsequent victims. During the weeks following the Wichita assault, Hain and Lambert continued their pattern of lesser crimes while planning more serious attacks. They were funding their lifestyle through theft and robbery while developing the confidence and methods that would enable them to commit more violent crimes. 2 months later, on September 5, 1987, the pair struck again, this time targeting a woman in her rural Kansas home near Goddard. They had spent time surveying rural properties, looking for isolated homes where they could operate without immediate risk of intervention from neighbors or law enforcement. Rural properties offered privacy but also required more planning and preparation than street crimes. The Goddard assault demonstrated their growing sophistication in criminal planning. They had to approach the property without being detected, gain entry to the home, control the victim, and escape without leaving obvious evidence. This level of planning showed that their criminal partnership was developing specific skills and methods. The victim of the Goddard assault was chosen specifically because of her isolation and perceived vulnerability. Hain and Lambert had learned to identify targets who would be unable to call for help immediately and who lived in areas where screams or other signs of distress would not attract attention from neighbors. During this attack, they demonstrated increased willingness to use violence and intimidation to control their victim. The rural setting allowed them to take more time with their assault, leading to more severe trauma for the victim and greater confidence in their ability to avoid capture. Law enforcement agencies in Kansas were now dealing with what appeared to be serial offenders, but connecting the crimes across jurisdictions proved challenging. Rural sheriff's departments often had limited resources for major investigations, and coordination between agencies required time and communication that allowed perpetrators to continue their activities. The rural nature of the second attack also meant that the victim was discovered later than in urban crimes, giving Hain and Lambert more time to escape and reducing the immediate availability of evidence. They were learning the advantages of choosing isolated locations for their most serious crimes. Just 19 days after the Goddard assault, on September 24, 1987, Hain and Lambert brought their crime spree back to Oklahoma with a home invasion in Tulsa. This decision to commit serious crimes in their home area showed their growing confidence and their belief that they had developed methods that would protect them from capture. The Tulsa attack represented another significant escalation in their pattern of violence. This time, they targeted a couple in their home, requiring them to control two victims simultaneously while committing robbery and sexual assault. The presence of two victims created additional risks, but also provided them with more opportunities for violence and theft. During the Tulsa home invasion, they permanently injured the male victim with a claw hammer, demonstrating their willingness to use weapons and inflict lasting physical damage. This attack showed that they were no longer simply using the threat of violence to control victims, but were willing to cause serious bodily harm to achieve their goals. The female victim was kidnapped from the home and taken to another location where she was sexually assaulted before managing to escape. Her escape represented the first time one of their victims had gotten away, and could potentially provide law enforcement with detailed information about the perpetrators and their methods. The victim's escape also demonstrated that Hain and Lambert were becoming careless in their confidence. They had allowed a victim to get away who could identify them and describe their criminal methods to law enforcement. This mistake would later prove crucial when investigators began connecting various crimes to the same perpetrators. The escalating violence of their attacks was creating more physical evidence and more traumatized victims who could provide testimony. Each crime was adding to a body of evidence that would eventually lead to their identification and capture, but they were too focused on immediate gratification to recognize these mounting risks. By early October 1987, Hain and Lambert had established themselves as dangerous predators who targeted vulnerable individuals across multiple jurisdictions. Their crimes were becoming more violent and more frequent, suggesting an escalation that could only lead to more serious outcomes. They had developed methods and gained confidence that made them believe they could continue their criminal activities indefinitely. The stage was set for the final, fatal encounter that would destroy the lives of Michael Houghton and Laura Lee Sanders and ultimately end their crime spree in the most tragic way possible. October 6, 1987, started as an ordinary Tuesday evening in Tulsa, but it would end with a crime so brutal that it would capture national attention and ultimately change American law. Scott Hain and Robert Lambert had been drinking earlier in the day, funding their activities through their ongoing criminal enterprises. As darkness fell over the city, they found themselves in the area around the Brookside Bar, a popular spot for young people to gather after work. Their original plan that night involved robbing a house near the bar. The two had been surveying the area, looking for what they considered an easy target. Houses in the Brookside district varied in their security measures, and Hain and Lambert had identified one that seemed vulnerable to break-in. They had brought tools with them, including implements that could be used to cut through barriers or disable security measures. As they prepared for the planned burglary, scanning the area for police presence and potential witnesses, they noticed Michael Houghton and Laura Lee Sanders sitting in Sanders' car in the parking lot. The two restaurant workers were engaged in casual conversation after their shift, unwinding in what they believed was a safe public space. Their relaxed demeanor and apparent comfort made them seem like easy targets to the two predators watching from the shadows. For Hain and Lambert, the presence of the two young people represented what they saw as an opportunity that was potentially more profitable and less risky than breaking into a house. Houses might contain alarm systems, angry residents, or unexpected complications. Two people sitting in a car appeared to offer a simpler target for robbery with the added benefit of potential vehicle theft. The decision to abandon their planned house robbery and target Michael and Laura Lee would transform what might have been a property crime into something far more serious. This moment represented the point where the lives of four young people became irreversibly intertwined, though only two of them knew it was happening. The approach was sudden and violent. Hain and Lambert forced their way into the car by threatening Michael with a knife. The weapon immediately escalated the situation from a potential robbery to an armed kidnapping. Michael and Laura Lee found themselves trapped with two men who had already demonstrated their willingness to use violence and who showed no hesitation in threatening their lives. Scott Hain took control of driving Laura Lee's car, removing the victims from the familiar surroundings of the bar parking lot. This transportation moved the crime from a public space where help might arrive to isolated locations where Hain and Lambert could operate without interference. For Michael and Laura Lee, leaving the parking lot meant leaving behind any hope of rescue from passers-by or security personnel. The first stop came quickly, as Hain pulled the car over in a more isolated area and began robbing Michael at gunpoint. When Michael attempted to resist the robbery, showing the natural human instinct to protect himself and Laura Lee, Hain forced him into the trunk of the car. This escalation showed how quickly the situation was spiraling beyond simple robbery into something much more dangerous. Laura Lee was forced into the trunk shortly afterward, trapping both victims in the confined, dark space where they could hear what was happening around them, but could no longer see their captors or surroundings. The trunk of a car becomes a terrifying prison where victims cannot anticipate what will happen next and have no means of escape. After securing both victims in the trunk of Laura Lee's car, Scott Hain and Robert Lambert demonstrated the calculated nature of their criminal thinking by deciding to steal Michael's truck as well. They took his keys and returned to the Brookside bar area, leaving their victims trapped and terrified while they completed this additional theft. For context, Michael's truck was parked at the Brookside bar, where he and Laura Lee had reportedly arrived separately for their after-work conversation. This was common for restaurant workers. They would drive their own vehicles to work and often meet colleagues afterward at nearby establishments. When Hain and Lambert initially approached Michael and Laura Lee, they were sitting in Laura Lee's car in the Brookside bar parking lot. After forcing their way into her car and driving away with both victims, they had Michael's truck keys, but had left his vehicle behind in the parking lot. The return to the Brookside bar represented a moment of extraordinary risk that revealed how detached from reality the two perpetrators had become. They were driving a stolen vehicle with two kidnapped victims in the trunk, yet they felt comfortable returning to the scene of the initial crime to steal additional property. This decision demonstrated their belief that they were operating above the law and beyond the reach of consequences. While Hain and Lambert were securing Michael's truck, Michael and Laura Lee remained trapped in the trunk of her car, experiencing terror that no human being should endure. The trunk space was cramped and dark, forcing them into physical contact while they tried to understand what was happening to them. They could hear sounds from outside, but had no way to see their surroundings or predict what their captors were planning. The plan to steal both vehicles indicated that Hain and Lambert were thinking beyond the immediate crime to their longer-term criminal activities. They saw the vehicles as resources for future crimes rather than focusing on ending their current criminal act safely. With Michael's truck secured, they now had two stolen vehicles and two kidnapped victims, escalating their crimes into the most serious category of felonies. Lambert drove Michael's truck while Hain followed in Laura Lee's car, with both victims still trapped in the trunk. This convoy arrangement also allowed Hain and Lambert to communicate with each other while maintaining control over their stolen property and victims. The drive to Creek County took them away from the urban environment of Tulsa through increasingly isolated territory. They traveled along Highway 97 and other rural roads, moving from areas with streetlights and regular traffic into countryside, where homes were separated by acres of farmland and wooded areas. This geographic transition represented the movement from a place where help might be available to locations where screams would go unheard. Their choice of destination in rural Creek County showed familiarity with isolated locations where they could operate without witnesses or interference from law enforcement. The area they selected was far enough from main roads to avoid casual discovery, but accessible enough for their vehicles. During the 30-minute drive, Michael and Laura Lee experienced escalating terror as they realized they were being taken to an isolated location. The trunk space provided no ventilation beyond what seeped in around the edges, creating an environment that was both physically uncomfortable and psychologically terrifying. Michael and Laura Lee would have been struggling with the heat generated by their own breathing, the exhaust from the vehicle, and the physical discomfort of being confined in a space not designed for human occupancy. Once they reached their chosen location in rural Creek County, Hain and Lambert began the systematic process of transferring Laura Lee's belongings from her car to Michael's truck. This wasn't a hurried process, but a methodical inventory of everything they considered valuable. They took clothing, personal items, and anything else they thought might be useful or profitable. Instead of rushing to escape, they took time to organize their theft, showing how completely they had dehumanized Michael and Laura Lee. The victims had become nothing more than sources of money and property to be exploited before being disposed of. This transfer process took considerable time, during which Michael and Laura Lee could hear activity outside the trunk. They began banging on the inside of the trunk and calling for help, desperately trying to communicate with their captors or attract attention from anyone who might be in the area. Their voices carried across the rural landscape, but no one was close enough to hear their pleas. Lambert used a cutting tool that Hain had brought to slice through the gas line of Laura Lee's car. This wasn't a spontaneous decision, but part of a plan they had discussed and prepared for. The tool was sharp enough to cut through the metal fuel line cleanly, ensuring that gasoline would flow freely when they were ready to set the fire. After cutting the gas line, gasoline began pooling on the ground beneath the vehicle, creating the conditions needed for a rapidly spreading fire. One of them then set the car on fire by placing a lighted newspaper and a blanket under the dripping fuel. The fire caught quickly, fed by the gasoline that was now flowing freely from the damaged fuel line. The flames spread rapidly across the ground and began climbing up the sides of the vehicle, creating intense heat that would soon make the trunk uninhabitable. As the flames began to spread around the vehicle, Michael and Laura Lee's desperate attempts to escape became more frantic. Their banging and yelling from inside the trunk indicated they were fully aware of their situation and fighting desperately to break free from their trap. The trunk lid was locked, and they lacked any tools that might help them force it open. The final minutes of their lives were spent in terror and pain as the fire consumed the oxygen in the trunk and filled the space with smoke and superheated air. Michael and Laura Lee died from a combination of smoke inhalation and burns, experiencing agony that no human being should endure. Rather than fleeing immediately after setting the fire, Hain and Lambert made a decision that revealed the complete absence of human empathy in their actions. They left the scene briefly, but returned a short time later to observe whether the fire was burning effectively, ensuring that their victims would not survive. This return to check on their victims' deaths demonstrated that killing Michael and Laura Lee was not an accidental result of their other crimes, but a deliberate goal they wanted to ensure was accomplished. They watched the car burn with their victims inside, showing satisfaction with their work rather than horror at what they had done. Only after confirming that the fire was consuming the vehicle effectively did Hain and Lambert finally leave the scene permanently. They drove away in Michael's truck, leaving behind the burning car that would become the tomb of two innocent young people whose only mistake had been being in the wrong place at the wrong time. On October 9, 1987, just 3 days after the murders, Scott Hayne and Robert Lambert were arrested in Tulsa. Their capture came through the trail of evidence they had left during their hasty escape from the crime scene. The investigation that followed would reveal the full scope of their criminal activities and build the case that would ultimately send both men to death row. The burned car containing the bodies of Michael Houghton and Laura Lee Sanders was discovered in rural Creek County, immediately alerting law enforcement to a serious crime. The condition of the vehicle and the circumstances of the deaths made it clear that investigators were dealing with a deliberate murder rather than an accident or suicide. Physical evidence at the scene began telling the story of what had happened. The cut gas line indicated premeditation, showing that the fire had been deliberately set rather than occurring naturally. Investigators could see that someone had intentionally damaged the vehicle to ensure it would burn. The location of the crime scene provided additional clues about the perpetrators. The isolated rural setting suggested that whoever committed the murders was familiar with the area and had chosen the location specifically for its privacy. This wasn't a crime of opportunity, but a planned execution. As investigators processed the scene, they began gathering evidence that would connect the crime to other activities. Personal belongings found near the scene helped establish the identities of the victims and provided clues about how they had come to be in that location. The investigation expanded as law enforcement agencies in Oklahoma and Kansas began comparing notes about unsolved crimes from the previous months. The pattern of violent assaults and sexual crimes that had been puzzling investigators suddenly began pointing toward the same perpetrators. Witness statements from the Brookside Bar area helped establish the timeline of events on October 6. People who had seen Michael and Laura Lee earlier that evening provided crucial information about their movements and the circumstances that had brought them to the parking lot where they were abducted. The discovery of victims' belongings at a residence in Jennings provided a direct link between the murders and specific individuals. Hayne and Lambert had made the crucial mistake of leaving evidence at a location that could be traced back to their social circle. Physical evidence from Michael's truck, which had been used in the escape, provided additional forensic material that would be crucial in building the prosecution's case. Fingerprints, DNA evidence, and other trace materials created a scientific foundation for connecting the suspects to the crimes. The arrest of Hayne and Lambert came as they attempted to return to their normal activities in Tulsa. Their behavior after the murders showed a complete lack of understanding of the seriousness of their actions and the inevitability of their capture. During initial questioning, both suspects made statements that would later be used against them in court. Their explanations for their activities and whereabouts during the relevant time periods contained inconsistencies and lies that investigators could easily disprove. The evidence gathered during the first days of the investigation created a strong foundation for prosecution. Physical evidence, witness statements, and the suspect's own words combined to build a case that would be difficult to defend against. As news of the arrests spread, additional victims of Hayne and Lambert's previous crimes began coming forward. Women who had been assaulted in Kansas and Oklahoma recognized the suspects and provided testimony that would help establish the pattern of escalating violence that had led to murder. The investigation revealed that Michael Houghton and Laura Lee Sanders had been innocent victims who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, targeted by predators who saw them as easy opportunities for robbery and violence. The prosecution of Scott Hayne and Robert Lambert began with separate trials, each presenting unique challenges for the legal system. The complexity of the crimes, the different ages and mental capacities of the defendants, and the overwhelming evidence all combined to create cases that would test Oklahoma's death penalty procedures. Creek County District Attorney's Office took the lead in prosecuting both cases. with the murders having occurred in their jurisdiction. The rural location of the crime scene meant that Creek County, rather than Tulsa County where the kidnapping began, would handle the prosecutions. The decision to try Hayne and Lambert separately reflected the prosecution's strategy of treating each defendant according to his individual circumstances and role in the crimes. This approach allowed prosecutors to tailor their arguments to each case while avoiding some of the complications that can arise in joint trials. For Scott Haynes' case, prosecutors faced the challenge of seeking the death penalty against someone who had been 17 years old at the time of the murders. While Oklahoma law permitted the execution of 17-year-olds, this aspect of the case would attract national attention and legal challenges. The prosecution's case against Hayne relied heavily on physical evidence from the crime scene, witness testimony about the events at the Brookside Bar, and Hayne's own statements to investigators. The strength of the evidence made conviction likely, but the question of appropriate punishment would prove more controversial. Robert Lambert's prosecution presented different challenges due to his obvious intellectual disabilities. His competency to stand trial became an immediate issue, requiring extensive psychological evaluation and multiple hearings before the court could determine that he understood the charges against him. The competency question for Lambert wasn't simply about whether he could assist in his defense, but whether he understood the nature of the proceedings and the potential consequences of conviction. His IQ of 68 and mental age of 8 years old created significant legal and ethical questions. Both prosecutions had to address the question of premeditation and deliberation required for first-degree murder charges. The evidence of planning, including the tools brought to cut the gas line and the return to check on the fire's effectiveness, supported the argument that these were not impulsive crimes. Before we continue deeper into the final outcome of this case, take a quick second to support the channel. Hit the like button if you're finding this story detailed and informative. Subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our next documentary breakdown. And let us know in the comments, do you think a 17-year-old should ever face the death penalty? Your thoughts help keep these discussions alive. Scott Allen Haynes' 1988 trial in Creek County District Court under Judge Donald D. Thompson centered on the fundamental question of whether a 17-year-old should face execution for the brutal murders of Michael Houghton and Laura Lee Sanders. The case drew considerable attention, both for Haynes' youth and the exceptionally cruel nature of the crimes. The prosecution presented a methodical and overwhelming case built on physical evidence from the crime scene, witness testimony establishing the victims' whereabouts before their disappearance, and Haynes' own statements to investigators. They constructed a clear timeline demonstrating Haynes' active participation throughout all phases of the crimes, emphasizing that despite his age, he had willingly engaged in premeditated acts of exceptional cruelty. Forensic evidence proved particularly damaging, with experts testifying about the deliberately cut gas line and accelerants used to ensure the fire would kill the trapped victims. While witness testimony from the Brookside Bar established that the victims had been alive and unharmed before encountering the defendants. Haynes' defense team faced the nearly impossible task of defending against overwhelming evidence of guilt, so they focused their strategy on his youth and argued he had been influenced by the older, more experienced Lambert. They presented evidence of his troubled family background, including his mother's alcoholism and lack of stable guidance, arguing these factors made him vulnerable to negative influences. The defense also emphasized that 17-year-olds lack adult judgment and impulse control, contending that executing minors violated evolving constitutional standards. The prosecution effectively countered by highlighting Haynes' extensive juvenile criminal record and his active role in the escalating violence leading to murder, arguing that age alone could not excuse such exceptionally cruel crimes. The testimony about the victims' final moments proved particularly powerful, as evidence showed Michael and Laura Lee had been conscious and fighting for their lives as the car burned around them. The jury's conviction on all counts, including 2 first-degree murder charges, was virtually inevitable given the strength of the evidence. The penalty phase proved more complex as jurors weighed aggravating factors, including the heinous nature of the crimes and Haynes' perceived ongoing threat to society against mitigating circumstances related to his age and background. Ultimately, the jury recommended death sentences for both murders, which Judge Thompson imposed along with additional prison time for other convictions, sending the 17-year-old to death row. Robert Lambert's journey through the legal system presented far greater complexity than his co-defendant Scott Haynes' case, primarily due to his severe intellectual disabilities that created fundamental questions about his competency and culpability. With an IQ of 68 and the mental age of an 8-year-old, Lambert faced capital murder charges while lacking the cognitive capacity to fully comprehend the legal proceedings or their potential consequences. The competency evaluation process became a central and recurring issue in Lambert's case. Multiple mental health professionals, including Dr. Goodman, conducted extensive evaluations that consistently documented his intellectual limitations, while the court struggled to determine the legal significance of his condition. His educational history provided clear evidence of these limitations, as he had failed to progress academically despite special education interventions and ultimately dropped out in 7th grade when the demands became insurmountable. Despite serious concerns about his ability to participate meaningfully in his defense, the court ultimately determined that Lambert possessed sufficient basic understanding of the charges and could communicate with his attorneys about the case facts. This finding allowed the prosecution to proceed, though the competency question continued to complicate every aspect of his case. Lambert's defense strategy centered entirely on his intellectual disabilities, arguing that someone with his limited mental capacity could not form the criminal intent necessary for first-degree murder and had been manipulated by the more sophisticated Haynes. The prosecution countered by emphasizing Lambert's willing participation in violent crimes and his danger to society, pointing to evidence that he had been the one to cut the gas line that enabled the fatal fire. This trial also led to a death sentence. Both Haynes and Lambert entered lengthy appeals processes immediately after their 1988 convictions. Haynes' 1993 appeal resulted in his murder convictions being upheld, but his death sentences vacated due to improper jury instructions about life without parole alternatives. This led to a dramatic 1994 resentencing, where prosecutors presented evidence of additional violent crimes and victim impact testimony that later proved constitutionally problematic. Despite renewed defense arguments about his youth and troubled background, the jury again recommended death. Lambert's appeals were complicated by his intellectual disabilities and procedural errors. His 1988 convictions were reversed in 1994, but his 1996 retrial produced identical results: conviction and death sentences. Both defendants then pursued extensive post-conviction appeals, raising issues of ineffective counsel, prosecutorial misconduct, and constitutional challenges. Haynes' federal appeals through habeas corpus petitions ultimately failed, with both the Federal District Court and 10th Circuit rejecting his arguments and affirming his death sentence. Lambert's appeals continued focusing on his intellectual disabilities, though clear Supreme Court precedent protecting such defendants didn't yet exist. The entire appeals process consumed 15 years, thousands of pages of legal documents, and significant emotional toll on victims' families while both men remained on death row. By 2003, with all appeals exhausted, Scott Haynes' final hope rested with the Oklahoma Pardon and Parole Board clemency hearing scheduled for March 31st, just days before his April 3rd execution date. The tight timing created intense pressure and media scrutiny around the proceedings. A significant legal dispute emerged when Haynes' attorney, Stephen Presson, argued he was entitled to federally funded representation for clemency proceedings. But the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals rejected this request. This left Presson arguing he couldn't adequately present Haynes' case without funds for expert witnesses and investigation, highlighting broader concerns about adequate legal representation in capital cases. The five-member parole board, led by Chairman Patrick Morgan, a former prosecutor, would hear arguments before making a recommendation to Governor Brad Henry. While the board's recommendation wasn't binding, governors rarely granted clemency without board approval. Haynes' personal appearance before the board proved counterproductive when he attempted to shift blame to Lambert, describing himself as an unwitting accomplice to an individual who put his will upon me. This statement likely damaged his case by suggesting a lack of genuine remorse or acceptance of responsibility, particularly given the extensive evidence of his active participation in the crimes. The prosecution emphasized the brutal nature of the murders and ongoing family trauma, while victims' family members provided powerful testimony requesting clemency be denied. International pressure from human rights organizations like Amnesty International highlighted that the United States was among only a few countries executing juvenile offenders, and polling showed 69% of Americans opposed such executions. Despite the international attention and evolving public opinion, the board deliberated briefly before unanimously voting 5-0 to deny clemency. This decision eliminated Haynes' last hope through normal legal processes, leaving only the possibility of last-minute court intervention or direct gubernatorial action to save his life. As Scott Haynes' execution approached, international human rights organizations launched an intensive campaign to prevent what would become the final juvenile execution in American history. Amnesty International led comprehensive efforts arguing that executing Haynes would violate multiple international human rights treaties, including the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the Convention on the Rights of the Child. The Organisation Mondiale contre la Torture condemned both juvenile executions and life sentences without parole for minors as forms of torture when applied to children. The campaign highlighted America's virtual isolation on this issue, noting that among developed nations, only the United States and Iran continued executing people for crimes committed as minors. The European Union formally protested through diplomatic channels, arguing the execution violated fundamental standards of civilized society and creating complications for American foreign policy objectives. International legal experts filed amicus briefs documenting the global consensus against juvenile executions, while human rights organizations compiled data showing the practice was declining even within the United States, with only 6 states having executed juvenile offenders since 1989. The campaign included detailed documentation of Haynes' troubled background as evidence of why children should not face adult penalties, emphasizing the connection between childhood trauma and later criminal behavior. Religious leaders from various denominations joined the effort, arguing that executing Haynes violated Christian principles of redemption and rehabilitation. Media coverage of the international protests exposed more Americans to arguments against juvenile execution, while the diplomatic pressure created challenges for Oklahoma Governor Brad Henry, who faced competing pressures between international opinion and domestic political considerations in a Republican-leaning state. Despite the unprecedented international attention and pressure, Oklahoma officials maintained they were bound by state law and court decisions to proceed with the execution, arguing that international opinion should not override American legal determinations. April 3, 2003, began with uncertainty about whether Scott Haynes' execution would proceed as scheduled. Last-minute legal appeals had created a complex situation where multiple courts were considering different aspects of his case, leaving everyone involved unsure about what would happen. The 10th Circuit Court of Appeals had granted a stay of execution late on April 2nd, based on Haynes' claim that he was entitled to federally funded legal representation at his clemency proceedings. This stay temporarily halted the execution and created hope among Haynes' supporters that the case might be reviewed further. Oklahoma Attorney General Drew Edmondson immediately appealed the stay to the United States Supreme Court, arguing that the lower court had abused its discretion by delaying the execution. The state's position was that Haynes' appeals had been exhausted and that the funding issue was not sufficient grounds for a stay. The Supreme Court's consideration of the stay created a dramatic situation where Haynes' life hung in the balance, while 9 justices debated whether to allow the execution to proceed. The court's eventual decision would demonstrate the deep divisions among the justices about juvenile execution. While the legal drama played out in the courts, Haynes spent his final day on death row in the H Unit at Oklahoma State Penitentiary. The conditions in H Unit meant that he remained in his small cell for most of the day, with limited contact with the outside world. Haynes' attorney, Stephen Presson, continued working frantically to save his client's life, filing additional appeals and arguments while monitoring the Supreme Court's deliberations. Presson's dedication to his clients was evident in his willingness to pursue every possible legal avenue until the very end. The victims' families gathered at the prison, preparing to witness the execution, while dealing with their own complex emotions about finally seeing justice carried out after 16 years of legal proceedings. For them, the day represented the potential end of a long ordeal that had dominated their lives. Media attention intensified throughout the day as reporters and news crews gathered at the prison to cover what might be the last juvenile execution in American history. The international attention made this execution different from the routine capital punishment proceedings that Oklahoma usually conducted. At 6 p.m., the originally scheduled execution time passed without the lethal injection taking place, as the Supreme Court continued to consider the state's appeal of the stay. This delay created additional stress for all participants, who had prepared emotionally for the execution at the scheduled time. The Supreme Court's decision came in the evening, with the justices voting 5-4 to overturn the stay and allow the execution to proceed. The narrow margin of the decision reflected the deep disagreement among the justices about the appropriateness of juvenile execution. With the Supreme Court's decision clearing the way, prison officials began the final preparations for Haynes' execution. The lethal injection protocol required careful timing and coordination among multiple staff members to ensure the procedure would be carried out efficiently. Haynes was given the opportunity to make a final statement, but declined, simply saying no when asked if he wanted to speak. His silence may have reflected acceptance of his fate or a decision not to provide additional material for media coverage of his execution. The execution began at 8:35 p.m., with Haynes receiving a lethal injection of drugs designed to stop his heart and breathing. The process took 4 minutes, with Haynes being pronounced dead at 8:39 p.m., ending a life that had been defined by violence and legal controversy. The execution of Scott Allen Haynes at 8:39 p.m. on April 3, 2003, brought an end to 16 years of legal proceedings and emotional trauma for the families of Michael Houghton and Laura Lee Sanders. The moment represented different things to different people: justice for some, tragedy for others, and a historical milestone for the American legal system. Stephen Presson witnessed his 8th execution from the observation room, watching as his client received the lethal injection that would end his life. Before the procedure began, Presson waved to Haynes, who acknowledged his attorney with a slight nod in their final interaction. The execution proceeded without complications, unlike some previous Oklahoma executions that had been marred by technical problems or protocol violations. Haynes remained conscious for approximately 4 minutes after the injection began, then stopped breathing and was pronounced dead. Family members of both victims attended the execution, finally witnessing the culmination of their long struggle for justice. Delma Houghton, Michael's mother, expressed relief that they would no longer have to deal with Haynes' presence in their lives. Carol Sanders, Laura Lee's mother, noted the peaceful nature of Haynes' death compared to the suffering her daughter had endured in the trunk of the burning car. This contrast highlighted the different standards of humanity applied to punishment versus the original crimes. Tenna Houghton Smith, Michael's widow, had remarried during the long legal process and struggled to move forward with her life while the case remained unresolved. The execution provided closure that allowed her to focus. The victims' families consistently stated that they took no joy in Haynes' death, but felt relief that the legal proceedings were finally over. Their 16-year ordeal with the criminal justice system had become a secondary trauma that compounded their grief over losing Michael and Laura Lee. Less than 2 years after Scott Haynes' execution, the United States Supreme Court handed down a decision that would have saved his life if it had come earlier. On March 1, 2005, the court ruled that executing people for crimes committed before their 18th birthday violated the Eighth Amendment's prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment. Today, more than 20 years after the murders of Michael Houghton and Laura Lee Sanders, the case continues to resonate through American legal and social consciousness. Scott Alan Haynes' execution as the last juvenile offender put to death in the United States ensures that his case will forever hold a unique place in the history of capital punishment. Robert Wayne Lambert remains in prison, serving life without parole after his death sentence was commuted due to his intellectual disabilities. His case took a different path than Haynes', with the Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals ultimately ruling in 2005 that his mental retardation made him ineligible for execution under the Supreme Court's Atkins v. Virginia decision. What are your thoughts? Should the system have spared him, or was justice served? Drop your opinions in the comments below. If you found this breakdown detailed and eye-opening, make sure to hit the like button so more people can see it. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next story as we continue uncovering the cases that shaped our justice system. And as always, share this video with someone who needs to know the truth behind the headlines.